Hey guys, thanks for tuning in to Exploring Reality, where you get to learn how to share the logical side of the Christian faith. If you watched the update video, I mentioned the resurrection project I'm working on. That first episode is most likely going to come out hopefully around the second week of August. In the meantime, a lot of you guys have requested I make some kind of philosophical arguments video. Especially some of you have asked me to talk about this particular argument. And so this is going to be a shorter video. It's not going to be a whole series. I just want this to serve as a brief overview for the argument. And I just want to give it to you guys as a tool as you contemplate reality. So let's talk about the argument from Arbitrary limits. As you would have guessed, this is a deductive argument. So for those of you unfamiliar with them, I'm going to just talk about what a deductive argument is. If you already know what it is, go ahead and skip to the next part. So this is a deductive argument, which is a structured equation of propositions that lead to a logical conclusion. So just like 2 plus 2 equals 4, there's a calculus that we can assign to a propositional argument. So for example, here is a deductive argument I'm sure we can all agree on, regardless of what your beliefs are when it comes to God's existence. Premise 1, all numbers ending in 0 or 5 are divisible by 5. Premise 2, the number 35 ends in a 5. Premise 3, or the conclusion, 35 is divisible by 5. This is what we would call a valid argument. It's valid if the premises can't all be true without the conclusion being true. An argument is valid if the truth of all its premises forces the conclusion to be true. It's valid if it would be inconsistent for all the premises to be true and its conclusion to be false. It's valid if its conclusion follows with certainty from its premises, and it's valid if it has no counterexample, that is, a possible situation that makes all the premises true and the conclusion false. That would be called a non sequitur. And obviously, then the next thing is that this argument is sound. The long story short is an argument is sound if it's both valid and the premises are true. The only way to attack these types of arguments is by attacking the premises. You can't attack the conclusion unless you want to try to show that it's a non sequitur. And so if you don't like the conclusion that 35 is divisible by 5, you have to attack one of those two premises. You can't just deny the conclusion. So let's move on from here. So before we get to the argument, this is, again, just a bird's eye view of one form of the argument from arbitrary limits. It's worth noting that this argument is meant to be a stage 2 argument. That is to say that it serves as a follow-up argument to different types of cosmological arguments. For example, my favorite argument that I would use is called the modal contingency argument. It argues for a necessary foundation of all contingent things. And then I would follow that up with this argument to attempt to identify what this necessary foundation is and show that it would be God. Moving on, this form of the argument isn't my favorite. My favorite form of the argument from arbitrary limits involves the use of modal logic, as well as some more modest premises that are easier for a skeptic to accept. But because I haven't talked about modal logic, S5, or some of these other things, I want to stay away from them because I haven't talked about them on this channel, and I want to kind of bring you guys into all these topics. If you do know about modal logic, S5, and all these other things, you can join my Discord server. The link will be in the bio of this video, and I'm more than happy to talk about my more favorite version of the argument. For now, I'm just going to lay out the argument and motivate each premise, and then we're just going to look at one objection to this type of argument. So here is the argument. There are limited things. Premise 2, the existence of limited things have some sort of explanation. Premise 3, the totality of limited things cannot be explained by limited things. So therefore, there is something purely unlimited. So let's go through each premise. There are limited things. It seems to me like this premise should be easy to accept, and it doesn't really need a defense. It's just an observation of reality and what it's like. My dog is limited in many different ways. Her geometry, the amount of matter that's within her body, the amount of power she possesses, the amount of speed she possesses, and unfortunately, how long she will live. Another example of a limited thing would be me or you. Think about all the quantifiable limits we have. And then when you think about all of them, there's some more that you can possibly think of. And so I think this is a pretty modest premise that leaves open the analysis of these limited things. Premise 2. The existence of limited things have some sort of explanation. And so this is what we would call the engine of the argument. Much like the Kalam cosmological argument has a premise called the causal principle, this argument has an explanatory principle. So how do we come about this premise being true? How do we come about accepting it? I have a few different lines of support I could use, but I think the most powerful are just from a line of experience and the use of reason. So for example, there is an explanation why I am so unfortunately limited when it comes to my height. My genetics. Another example that's more complex would be in my own consciousness. I seem to be able to witness a relationship between my intentions and subsequent mental states. And that relationship seems to be one of explanation. If my intention is to eat, the subsequent mental state was one that said I am hungry. One more example, it seems like the universe itself is limited. There's only so much matter in it, and it seems like it is consistent with reason to ask why. One may be tempted to just say it is just that way without explanation, but why think that? This is where something Dr. Rasmussen calls the principle of irrelevant differences comes in and is useful. It seems like there's no relevant difference between the limits of the universe and the limits of other things. So by experience, I seem to witness explanations of limited things. Then from reason, it seems that I can extrapolate from there, and I consider what kinds of things would exist without an explanation. It seems like limited things differ from each other in ways that, when I think about it, they don't really seem to be relevant to existence without an explanation. And so for this reason, it seems that if I want to explain things as far as I can, that my default stance is to think that limited things can have some further explanation. And that this will hold for any limited things, whether it's limited thoughts, limited pizza, limited planets, a universe, etc., etc. In general, unless I have some special reason for making an exception to this rule, I'm going to expect that any limited thing can, consistent with reason, have some further explanation. Premise 3, the totality of limited things cannot be explained by limited things. So, this is just a basic non-circularity premise. I say this because if we were to explain limited things by limited things, we would just be explaining the totality of limited things by something within itself, which is just explaining in a circle. The kind of explanation we want here is an external explanation or an outside explanation, not an internal one. This premise is about the general fact that there are limited things, and it's not specific to the actual particular limit of things. The idea here is that in order to explain this general fact, we're going to have to appeal to something that's beyond the fact itself, something that is not self-limited. And so, from this premise, we get to our conclusion, which follows from all the rest of the premises. Therefore, there is a purely unlimited thing. When I say it's purely unlimited, what I mean is that this thing has no fundamental limits, because if it had some fundamental limit, then it would count as a limited thing according to our definition. And so, an unlimited thing that is prior to and is a foundation of all limited things would have no fundamental limits. Now, this conclusion seems to be very important. It seems to give credence to the idea that this foundation or this first cause would be something more like God than another universe, or some type of matter, or some type of time, or whatever it might be. So there's not really that many objections to it. For this version of the argument especially, there's only really one objection I can foresee one using. Any attempts to deny the second premise, most of the time in my experience, it's just boiled down to, well, you don't know for sure that all of them have an explanation, which is more of an epistemic issue than it is an objection to the premise. So here's the objection. Every limited thing we experience is explained by something limited. And this seems to be an objection that I get to premise 3, the non-circularity premise. So my response is that I think this is a valuable objection, and I have a few things I could say. First, I think there's a sort of selection effect problem, because we're only in position to see things that are themselves limited, so any causes that we see are going to be limited. That's all our sight can really pick up, at least directly. So think about it like this. Suppose there are some kind of ultimate unlimited cause or foundation that is purely unlimited. Well, then we couldn't see it directly. What I mean is anything that we would see with our eyes would have particular boundaries and limits, so we wouldn't really be able to see that what this foundational thing is. We can't directly detect a lack of limits if something has no limits. And so here's an analogy I think that might be helpful in understanding this. If Dr. Rasmussen likes to use this one a lot. It's a fishing analogy where you go fishing with a net that has holes. Let's say the holes in the net are big enough so that you can only catch fish that are at least 10 inches long. You put the net into the lake and catch some fish, and some of them are 12 inches, some of them are 11 inches, some are 13, some are 20. But you never catch anything less than 10 inches. Would it follow, therefore, that there are no fish in the lake that are less than 10 inches long? No, because you're not in a position to actually know whether or not there are fish that are less than 10 inches long because your net is set to that standard. And so in the same way, if there were an unlimited explanation of limited things, you wouldn't be in a position to directly see its lack of limits. Now, maybe you could infer its lack of limits based on a kind of argument from arbitrary limits like this one. And in fact, that's the point of the argument from arbitrary limits. It's to see how far we can explain things. And if we can explain limits, then it seems that it would follow that there could be something unlimited as the ultimate explanation of limited things. A second point that I want to make is that if every limited thing is explained in terms of limited causes, well then of course there's no ultimate cause of limited things, because any such cause would be among those limited things, and that would be circular. So then it would follow that limited things in total are unexplained, but then this result seems to stop the explanation chain unnecessarily short, and it seems at least possible to have a further explanation of limits. And so if that's right, then the total of limits should have a further explanation. And like I said, that was a short video. I just wanted to kind of give this guys to you as a tool. If you want to talk about my more preferred argument that has some more objections to it and has some more meat to it, join the Discord server, and I'm more than happy to talk with you guys. Thank you so much for listening, and if you want to be a supporter of the ministry, the link to the donation page is right below. If you want to talk to me before you want to try to be a supporter, I'm more than happy to talk. And with that, thanks for listening, guys. I'll see you guys at the beginning of the Resurrection Project.